So remember last week when I said this, but I'm very excited to say that the corset should be done. Oh gosh, this just feels like it's moving so fast. It's just moving too smoothly and it is making me nervous. So fingers crossed nothing too crazy happens from here out. Yeah, it went wrong. So I am struggling with this bodice. So I'm using velvet. I've only used velvet once before, and I was really struggling with getting that trim onto the velvet. Velvet, or at least this velvet, moves around a lot. So I did a lot of hand basting, which is what those blue threads are, to hold everything in place, and then I serged it and treated the canvas and the velvet like one piece of fabric. That's fine. That turned out perfectly fine. And then I stitched it all together, which is what you saw last week, and that also turned out fine, mostly fine. It was a little wrinkled in my seams, but I didn't really think that much of it. I thought maybe my basting stitches were still doing them, but I thought everything was okay. Like you saw last week, I was happy. I thought everything was gonna be okay. So then I realized two things. One, I accidentally made the bust cups a little flat, so I actually curved those back out, adjusted my front panel pattern pieces, and then cut those out, redid them, and stitched them into the bodice. That's fine, whatever. It took me like 15 minutes to do, so not a big deal. So then I started to try and get that trim on. So that trim is called military braid. It is very stiff. It has a little bit of bend to it, but not a lot before it starts to like pucker on itself. It's that deep golden yellow. It has a design embroidered into it. It's got a little metallic sheen to it. It's very beautiful. My thought was, after my last video, that I was no longer going to put the boning into this part of the fabric. I was going to put the boning in the lining and then let that be the structure, which is fine. I wouldn't call it a corset at that point. That would be a bodice, which realistically this is a bodice. It's a structured bodice. I wouldn't classify this as a real corset. That was my plan, and that's fine. That probably would have been fine. So I went ahead and moved on to putting the military braid across all of the seam. Well, that wound up being an incredibly difficult process. The stiffness of the braid, top of the squishiness of the velvet, did not go well together whatsoever. Nope. I would start to stitch through the braid. The braid does not give because it's so stiff. It doesn't really give, if you know what I mean. And the plush underneath it, that would bend one way or bend the other as I'm stitching it. There was no consistency, so the braid, rather than being straight, would go bloop or bloop. And I could not get it to go straight. So I figured out this rather convoluted way of stitching this on. It works though, so like it's not stupid if it works, right? So I took this 1 foot, which I can't remember the name of at the moment. It has, the teeth of it are very wide. It was just about the same size as the braid. I used that to hold the braid down and put pressure on both sides of it and stitch down the middle to hold it in place. And I switched it over to the hem foot, or whatever this other one is called. It has this little piece of metal in the middle that I was able to use to keep pressure on the braid as the needle came behind it, and I would stitch it down one side and stitch down the other side. So each piece has 3 rows of stitching. I was like, this seems fine. I was able to get them straight, or as close to straight as possible, and I was mostly happy with it to a point. I kept getting this like, I don't know, it just wasn't looking right. I was looking at it and I'm like, this doesn't look nice. This doesn't look crown worthy. What is wrong with it? And it really clicked when I did it across the bust area, and I could really see all this puckering in my velvet. And no matter how many times I redid it, I couldn't get that puckering to go away. So then I took out all my basting stitches and looked at the whole thing, and every seam is puckered. It looks terrible. It looks like I can't make a bodice. It is so irritating, and I was just like, I don't know what's wrong. So I decided to go ahead and try to remake it, but I didn't know what the problem was. I thought maybe my basting stitches were too big or too loose, or something happened along those lines. Went out and bought some basting glue, some spray basting glue. I was going to try 2 things. I was going to try spraying down some basting glue and stitching that and see how that looks. And then the other idea was to, rather than do those diagonal basting stitches, I was just going to hand stitch around the perimeter of the piece and try restitching it that way. But then it occurred to me as I was inspecting what I had already created, thankfully before I cut out more velvet panels, I found my problem. I forgot, for some reason, to pay attention to my grain direction. When I cut out the velvet for the original bodice, I didn't pay attention, I guess, to how I was positioning my pattern pieces. So all of them are cut on the... So when I cut out my velvet, I cut it out like this, which means when I was stitching it together and adding the trim on top, it was doing this. It was moving around. It was stretching. It got puckered. So fortunately, I had a little bit of velvet left, and I was able to cut out all new pieces. I still tested the glue, and I tested the hand basting. I wound up preferring the hand basting over the glue. I don't really want to wash this in soap and water. I don't quite know how the velvet will react, and the basting glue really does need to be washed out, which I'm debating on whether or not I should do it, but I just wasn't a fan of the glue. So I hand basted all the pieces, all the velvet onto the canvas except for the back 2 panels or so, and serged all those together, and it immediately looked better. Like, just immediately, my panels looked gorgeous, and I am in the process of stitching them all together. I think I just have the front panel left to sew on. So that's where I'm at. I wasted an entire week and an entire thing of that military braid to just remake it. But to be fair, this is all an experiment, right? Like, I've used velvet once on my Scarlett O'Hara, which didn't pucker. I was trying to figure out why. It's because I cut it out correctly. And this is my first go at this new corset pattern. It's my first time using military braid, and it's fine. So now I'm correcting all of my mistakes. So now I am, in this new corset, I am now putting the boning channels into the velvet and canvas pieces. Before putting the trim on, I really just like that structure in the front, so I'm correcting that now. I've corrected how I did the grommet panel because I just immediately folded it over and then realized I was going to hand stitch in the lining to cover up that fold. So I made a bunch of mistakes. I'm now correcting them. So it's not a bad thing. This new version will be better made. And realistically, can you call it a competition piece if you didn't have to remake at least some major piece at one point in time? So I am a week behind what I thought I was going to be, but I do think I can make it up over this weekend and launch into next week. But first, I do want to talk about a brand of needles called Oregon Needles. This is not sponsored, but they did come up to me at MomoCon and they gave me some samples of their needles. I typically use whatever came with my machine, which at this point in time is Bernina brand needles, and then I just go to Walmart, buy the ones that start with an S. I can't remember the name and I don't want to mispronounce it, so I'll put it up here so that you can see the brand. I think most people probably use these. They're a universal brand of needle. I've never put any sort of effort or thought into what kind of needle I'm using. I just buy whatever. When it breaks, it breaks. When it goes dull, it goes dull, and I just buy new ones and whatever is cheapest. However, I spoke to the representatives from Oregon Needle when they came up to my booth at MomoCon, and I've talked to them quite a bit on Instagram as well through DM, and they've explained to me various uses of their different kinds of needles, the importance of switching out your needle, and this may be common knowledge to a lot of other people, but I am a completely self-taught seamstress. I took one class in high school instead of home ec. I took sewing, and they taught me how to make a teddy bear and a pair of boxer shorts, and how to install a zipper and thread a sewing machine, and that's about it. And that was a long time ago, and then I didn't pick up sewing again until many, many years later, and I had never made anything like what I make now. So I'm completely self-taught. So I was so thankful for them to take the time to give me some more education on how I'm sewing and how I'm constructing my pieces, and the importance of using the appropriate needle. So I want to talk about the one that I used in this. So they gave me 3 different kinds. They gave me an anti-glue needle, an anti-glue embroidery needle, and they gave me a knit needle, a super knit needle. It's supposed to work for very stretchy material, and I can't quite remember the third one off the top of my head, but none of those really fit what I was doing until now. So when I used that basting glue, I used their anti-glue needle. So I just decided to go ahead and get the needles so I could show them to you. So Oregon anti-glue embroidery needle, and you can see it here. This needle has a special coating on it so that when you stitch through things like basting glue, which is used a lot in embroidery, it resists the buildup of that sticky substance on the needle. So I thought it was an excellent opportunity to finally give Oregon needles a try. And I had not heard of an anti-glue needle before, again, completely self-taught, and I didn't really spend a lot of time looking at needles. So that is what I did. I have stitched through adhesive before with a standard needle, and I have had it completely gunk up my needle. I couldn't continue stitching through. I'd have to like stitch a couple inches and keep some alcohol near me so I could clean off my needle, stitch a couple inches, clean off my needle again, and just keep going through that. And eventually I actually had glue like that gum up my sewing machine. I am so happy to report that this worked so well. I did an entire row of stitching, and I used a lot of glue. Like, I don't typically use basting glue anymore, but I did. I used a lot because I was uncertain of how much, but it went right through. It didn't catch on the fabric, because sometimes when you stitch through adhesive, after a few stitches, because the needle got gummed up, it pulls up your fabric as you're stitching. That didn't happen at all. It went right through, and I took my fingers and like tapped it on the needle, and there was nothing on the needle. So I finished basting around, or I finished stitching that seam, and I went and stitched the next seam, and I tested it again. No gunky buildup. So I was able to stitch 4 panels together using this basting glue and had no problems whatsoever. Even at the end of the last row of stitches, there was still no sticky residue on the needle, and on top of it, it didn't pull my fabric up. There was nothing. So this is phenomenal. I have some upcoming embroidery pieces for this project that I will be doing, and I will be using basting glue for, and I have a couple other embroidery things I will be doing outside of this project. So I will absolutely be using these needles for that, to just keep testing it and see how long I can push it before it does start to build up, if it ever does. But this is super amazing. So thank you, Oregon Needles, for giving me a few samples and walking me through the uses and importance of switching out my needles. I did, because I was very excited about these, I did go ahead and buy a bunch of different other kinds of Oregon needles to try. So I am going to be using those periodically, or I'm going to be using those throughout my Sakizo build, and I will report back on those. My main thought is just testing the longevity of the needles and the breakage points. I have a very bad problem with breaking needles, given the unique things that I do with sewing. So I'm very excited to see the durability of Oregon needles, and if it'll remain sharp throughout the whole project, or how often I'll have to replace it. So more to come on that. But again, thank you, Oregon Needles, for giving me these samples, and I will continue to test you out over the next 6 or so months. So I just wanted to mention that and give you an update on my project. That's where we're at. The plan for next week is to hopefully I'll have my bodice finished. I finally got gold grommets. I finally got gold eyelets. I don't know what it is about the scarcity of eyelets these days, especially if you want gold, but I finally got some gold ones. Hopefully they're right. I tried some from Amazon. Never order eyelets from Amazon. Just don't do it. They're trash. They could look like the right ones, and then they wind up being just absolute garbage. I have not had any luck with eyelets from multiple different listings from Amazon. Just, it's not worth it. So if I do finish my bodice corset this weekend, then next week I will work on the petticoats. I'll work on actually finishing up the crinoline, and then I'll make the petticoat and then mock up the skirt so that I can estimate how much fabric I need to order. So that's where we're at. hopefully this goes a little bit smoother. If you like these updates, make sure to hit the subscribe button so that you get my post every week. And again, I will be posting longer format videos going over the construction process and giving more detail about what I have made and how I made it. And if you have any questions or comments, of course, put them down below. Hit the like button if you liked this video, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!